everybody, and welcome to the Commander Pod, your Magic the Gathering podcast for all things Commander. My name is Kelton Howell.
And I'm Spencer Simpson. And today we're going to be talking about troubleshooting your Commander deck.
That's right.
Because we've all taken a brand new deck that we've built, a new brew that we're excited about, to a playgroup and walked away just feeling so sad because it didn't do what we were expecting it to do.
I don't know what you're talking about, man. My deck is perfect every time. Doesn't matter. I've never had a bad deck.
Yeah. Well, I have a lot of them. And it's usually my fault. I think it's easy to walk away from playing with a pod, especially if you're playing with like a new group of people, and feel like it was like an unfair matchup potentially, and look anywhere else to say, oh, well, you removed my commander, so now I couldn't do anything. And more often than not, it is actually a diagnosable problem in your deck. Now, that's not always the case, but we want to handle the cases where we want to look at ourselves first and see how we can fix the problem.
Yeah, totally. And I mean, I've been encountering this with a deck that I'm building right now. I think I'm on the 5th iteration of this deck where every time I build it, it just doesn't feel like it's having the right experience in my playgroup, and that feels pretty bad. It does. It's not very fun, and it can just really get you down. So we are going to just talk about the different symptoms that you may be experiencing, trying to help you diagnose them, give you some options for fixing them. But there are a few caveats that we want to talk about before we jump into that conversation. The first one is we don't want to talk about changing your deck in terms of upgrading or downgrading to be more powerful, in that it makes it better or worse, because you in a casual pod are building to a specific power level for a specific play experience.
Yeah, more powerful does not necessarily equal better. I went through a phase that I think I'm just kind of getting over. I swear it wasn't a phase, but it is, hopefully, that I was acquiring all these staples and I wanted to put them in these decks because they were new, fun cards that I wanted to play with. And Dockside Extortionist, Mana Drain, really cool cards that for me, because I had a relatively low budget for Commander for a long time, and as my budget was expanding, I got really excited about these new cards that I had access to and started putting them in every deck where they fit, and then realized that wasn't the experience that my playgroup wanted to have. I started putting in tutors and Dockside Extortionist, Mana Drain, and started doing really well all the time. And honestly, it felt like my decks were doing the thing they wanted to do, but at the expense of the experience my playgroup wanted to have. And that's worse. Like, my decks were more powerful, but that experience is objectively worse. So again, we want to decouple power level to better, because I think you can make your deck better by powering it down when the goal is to have fun with your friends.
Absolutely.
And have your deck win by doing the thing.
Absolutely. And I've done the same thing when I've acquired staples. I'm like, great, I have this super cool new card. Maybe it's a super cool new white card. Then I'm like, okay, what are all of my decks that run white? Let's stick it in all of the white decks. The problem with that is as you acquire more staples, as you acquire more powerful cards, they start going into all of your decks. Now all of your decks really look and feel the same. Like they're running a lot of just generically powerful cards, and you're actually just going to end up kind of having the same game with all of your decks. And that also isn't fun. So I guess a word of caution there as we talk about these things. The other thing that we want to talk about is doing the thing, which I think is a phrase that we hear in Commander a lot. What does that phrase mean, Spencer?
Yeah, I want my deck to do the thing. You walk away feeling bad if your deck didn't do the thing. I want everyone's decks to be able to do the thing. And typically, that's something you've built around with your commander. There's maybe a combo in there, not necessarily an infinite combo, but a cool combo of cards that you want to put in there. Like you're playing a Voltron deck and you have a couple equipment that you want to attach to your commander. It's whatever really you want to accomplish with your deck. It's the mindset you've gone into with your deck building. And a lot of what happens when you walk away feeling bad is either your deck didn't do the thing at all, or it didn't do enough of the thing. Like the goal of casual Commander, obviously it's a game and we're all trying to win. But especially in casual, we're trying to win in a way that's like fun and exciting to us, right? Like I don't play a lot of Boros and Selesnya. I have like one Voltron deck, and it's really fun, except that I've played games with it where I've taken one player out and then we've played for another 30 minutes.
Yeah.
You know, and for me, that's like not very fun. I really love building decks that are super resilient and are constantly putting pressure on the game. So as a result, I play a lot of like Sultai, Reanimator, blue, black, green, which is Sultai, but just all those colors because they have a lot of access to those things that let you, even if you've been blown out by a board wipe, right, or whatever, you can still catch up.
So that's your thing is like this Reanimator kind of value engine type thing. That's what you're trying to do. And if the game gets to its close, you haven't been able to do that. Like maybe there's just board wipe after board wipe. You're never able to get like things up and going. Then you probably doesn't feel very fun. It's not a good thing. So whatever your thing is, if it's +1/+1 counters, if it's Reanimator, if it's mill, if it's, tokens, whatever it is, you want to build your deck so it does the thing. So a lot of the things that we're going to be talking about today are how to help your deck do more of the thing. So the first one that we're going to start with is your deck doesn't feel like it's doing enough of the thing. You have synergy in your deck. So maybe you have a +1/+1 counter deck and you have something cool like the Ozolith or like some really cool +1/+1 counter synergies in it. But when you play, it doesn't feel like it gets to do enough of that. It just kind of feels like you have inconsistent games.
Yeah, and I should say all the things we're talking about right now are going to be symptoms, and those can even be hard to recognize when you're playing, right? It can, but I think this one is pretty easy, right? It's pretty easy to walk away and say, "Oh, that wasn't very fun." And some of these might be a little harder and harder to diagnose, and some of them will lead to this, right? Is that your deck isn't doing enough of the thing, and often it's because you're not including enough of specific effects in your deck. And we're going to talk about some of those individually as part of the troubleshooting because they are really important. But there's been a lot of guides that have been put out.
Yeah, one of my favorite ones and one that I have followed a lot in a lot of the decks that I've built is what do they call it? It's the Command Zone deck building template. Is that what they call it?
I think it was the deck building template and then they did an update on it.
Yeah. So the updated one is the one that I have followed since they posted it. I think it's a good place to start. And that is you want 10 to 12 pieces of ramp, 10 pieces of card draw, 10 to 12 pieces of single target removal, 3 to 4 board wipes, and 35 to 38 lands. And that's like a general deck building template. But as I've built those decks, and I think as we've had a lot of conversations, Spencer, there are some things about this that we like to do maybe a little differently, or things that we've learned in deck building that maybe strays a little bit more from this template.
Yeah. I mean, so the numbers here again, we've got 10 to 12 ramp, 10 card draw. I think what I've realized in my deck building is that to me, that doesn't feel like enough sometimes. I think a lot of these numbers are, I would consider them a bare minimum.
Yeah.
Like it's the decks that I'm building these days that have less than 12 pieces of ramp, especially less than 10 pieces of ramp, are pretty few and far between. These days I kind of shoot for more like 15.
Yeah.
And that's just because on turns 2 and 3, I want to be ramping so that on turn, 4 and 5, instead of 4 and 5 mana, I've got, 6, 7 potentially.
Yeah. And that's a really important piece of information is like, you, especially ramp, you want in your hand early. Most of my decks, turn 2, it feels so good to play an Arcane Signet on turn 2. Like by turn 2, you kind of want to have ramped. That is like the ideal place to start ramping, or to have ramped, is turn 2. So one of the tools that you can use to think through this and help with your deck building is a hypergeometric calculator. I couldn't tell you how a hypergeometric calculator is different than another calculator and like how the relationships between the numbers work, but that's why they've made the calculators so you don't have to do the math on your own. There's a really good one on EtherHub and you can find it on Google. If you put in the population size, which would be your deck size, the sample size, which is the number of cards that you see, the successes in the population, which is how many of that effect you have in your deck, and then how many successes you need in your sample. then it's going to calculate the percentage of how likely that is to happen. So, for example, if you have, let's be very generous and say you have 10 pieces of ramp, which is on the lowest end of what we were talking about. But let's say they're all 2 mana rocks, which is pretty good. That's like kind of the ideal place that you want to have your ramp. Obviously, there's stuff like Soul Ring and faster stuff, but let's just talk about 2 mana rocks for now. Let's say that you have 10 of them in your deck. By turn 2, you will have seen 9 cards. The 7 that you start with, the 1 you draw on your first turn, the 1 you draw on your second turn. The likelihood of you having one of those 10 mana rocks in your hand on turn 2 is only 63%. You're only 63% likely to have ramped on turn 2 in that game if all 10 of the ramp pieces are 2 mana.
Yeah, and often they're not going to be, right? You at some point, depending on the number of colors you're running, but especially in like 2-color decks, Arcane Signet, Dimir Signet, I'm talking about Dimir because I think about Dimir a lot, Talisman of Dominance, Felwar Stone are the 4 color-producing 2 mana rocks that I can think of, right?
Yeah.
And then
Sorry,
you can
I can't get over it that you think about. Spencer's always thinking about Dimir, man. It's always on your mind.
So funny. Isn't that funny that the first one that I thought of was Dimir Signet?
That's great.
But then you have like Mind Stone and Talisman of not Talisman, Thought Vessel. Like you have a couple other ones, Liquid Metal Torque. There's a bunch that are 2 mana rocks that produce colorless, which you're happy with, but maybe not as happy as one that produces, mana of a specific color. Yep. I mean, Charcoal Diamond, Sky Diamond, great 2 mana rocks. Like Absolutely. Often if you're spending your turn ramping, who cares?
Yep.
Like they're going to give you 1 additional mana on turn 4, which is what you're looking for. So you could probably get 10. And honestly, that's what I've had to do more recently is I was stuck in this mindset of I need to run the 2 mana rocks and 3 mana is too much mana for me to be spending to ramp. Mm-hmm. And to include the volume of ramp that you want, that is just simply not the case, right?
Yeah, especially in monocolor. I mean, I will say, though, the benefit of running monocolor is that you can play colorless ramp, and it's actually not that bad. Like, in Shieldred, I think I have 15 pieces of ramp that are 2 mana or less. And that's not playing any fast mana besides Soul Ring. Mm-hmm. Maybe it's playing Mana Vault, but I'd have to go and check. But it's because in that deck, I care so badly. The deck, I should be more specific, is Shieldred the Apocalypse. That's 2 black for the 4/5 Death Touch. That whenever you draw a card, you gain 2 life. Whenever your opponent draws a card, they lose 2 life. I care so much in that deck about getting Shieldred out on turn 3 and then doing some big thing on turn 4 that I just need that 2 mana ramp. And so with those numbers, if I've seen 9 cards by turn 2, but I have 15 of those effects, I'm now 78% chance to have the hand that I want to be able to ramp on turn 2. And that is like just a significant increase.
Yeah, it's a 14 percentage point increase, right? But like a 30% increase nearly, or a 25% increase in your chance, total chances, right? From like 65 to like 70, nearly 80. That's crazy.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, and that really is like the first thing we wanted to cover is that your deck maybe is just like playing too slow. And often like the problem is that you're not including enough ramp. 5, 7, 8 pieces of ramp is just simply not enough to get you where you want to be able to keep up with most modern Magic the Gathering tables, right?
Yeah.
And again, not that you want to keep up with most tables. Like maybe your playgroup doesn't play a lot of ramp and you want to play longer, slower games, and that's also totally fine. But if you find that your deck is playing too slow and other people's decks are playing significantly faster than yours, then that is definitely the place to look, right? Is do I have enough ramp in my deck? And then the answer is probably not if it's less than 10 to 12 or more.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And in general, if you feel like your deck isn't doing enough of the thing, then you need to be like, okay, what is the thing that my deck is trying to do? Is it trying to play +1/+1 counters? Is it trying to draw cards? Is it trying to make tokens? Then you got to go in and look, okay, how many of those effects do I have in my deck? And how many do I need to feel like I'm seeing enough of those effects throughout the duration of a game. So check your numbers, play with the calculator if that's the way that your brain works, and that helps you think through it. But if your deck isn't doing enough of the thing, make sure that you have enough of the thing in your deck.
Yeah. I mean, the first thing my mind jumps to when I think about the cards that I want that fit the specific theme of my deck are like kindred decks. Like for me, jumping back to blue black, is I have a Will Help the Rock Cleaver zombie deck, and it includes, I think, like 29 total zombies, which, it has been enough for the deck so far, but that's because I've also indexed pretty heavily on like card draw and stuff like that. But in a lot of decks, like in my Sidisi Brood Tyrant deck, which is it's 1 blue, black, green. When it enters, you mill 3, and then whenever you mill 1 or more creatures, you create a 2/2 zombie. You want that effect every time when it enters or when it attacks, and so your deck needs to have like enough creatures in it. And I found when I was building the deck, I had like 30 creatures, and that's normally the number that I kind of have, around 30 creatures in a deck, depending on the strategy. And it just wasn't enough. And now I've got like 36, 37, and a lot of decks run like upwards of 50. And I probably need to adjust my numbers because I have run maybe too much interaction that's not on creatures or something,
Yeah, and that's a really good point, is that if your deck cares about a specific creature type, or just creatures in general, or enchantments in general, or artifacts in general, then you have to put in things that ramp you, things that draw you cards, things that remove threats on the board. Try to find synergistic cards that match your thing, what your deck is trying to do, that also ramp you, draw you cards. One of the decks that I've built that I had so much fun doing this with was Noble Baloth. So this is a background deck. Baloth Baratil is 4 and a red for a 2/5 elf shaman. Creatures your opponents control with power less than Baloth Baratil's power are goaded, and whenever a goaded attacking or blocking creature dies, you create a treasure token. Then you get to choose a background, and the background is Noble Heritage. Commander creatures you own, this is 1 and a white for an enchantment. Commander creatures you own have, when this creature enters the battlefield and at the beginning of your upkeep, each player may put 2 +1/+1 counters on a creature they control, and for each opponent who does, you gain protection from that player until your next turn. So the point of the deck is to play Baloth Baratil, pump him up, pump the rest of the board up, and make it so that everyone's attacking, but they're not attacking you. And that's a really fun kind of interactive deck, and that's why I like it. A couple of the ramp pieces that I found that I was so excited about for this deck that works synergistically with this deck are like Iron Crag, which is from Wilds of Eldraine. It's like a 3 mana rock that taps for colorless, but then when you play a legendary creature, it turns into an equipment that then buffs its power, which is what Baloth Baratil needs, so that its power is bigger than everything else on the board. And so when you find those synergistic little gems that just you wouldn't play them except for it's really synergistic in your deck, that's, for me, that's one of the really fun parts about Commander.
Yeah, and like, why wouldn't you run the Iron Crag in? It's a 2 mana rock, actually. It's 2 mana. Yeah, it's only 2. Good. So yeah, why wouldn't you run that over something like a Liquimetal Torque, which, cares about turning things into artifacts, but your deck doesn't care about it? And I agree. I think that's one of the things that's really fun about Commander. And I think it's one of the things that you should think about when you're building your deck. Like you're saying, if it cares about creatures or artifacts specifically, or whatever your strategy may be, try to find cards that have the effects that you want: ramp, card draw, removal. Those are kind of the big 3 typically that fit into that strategy or whatever the thing is that you're trying to do that your commander or your deck cares about.
Yeah. Yep. Absolutely.
Yeah. So, jumping back, ramp was kind of the first thing we talked about. We jumped into that a little bit. That is when your deck is too slow. That is often the problem, is that you just don't have enough ramp. You're running just too little of that effect. The other problem could be, and again, we primarily want to focus on our deck building process, what could be going wrong here. But the other problem really could be that your deck isn't isn't at the same power level as the rest of your play group that you're playing with.
Absolutely, because some decks just take 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. The list goes on. However many turns it needs to be able to do the thing, while other decks can just do the thing much faster. And so it's easier for those decks to be more powerful, feel more powerful. And if you're playing a slower deck, one that just requires more setup, takes longer to have a payoff, takes longer to do the thing, you're just not going to have a good experience against those faster decks. And so there may be disparity of power level between those decks.
Yeah, and you could tackle this by upgrading your own deck, right? You could say you could buy some cards that make your deck a little bit more powerful. Obviously, make it a little more faster, right? You could get maybe put some rituals or whatever if you're playing in those colors. Like there's ways to do that, but I think more importantly, you just have a discussion with your play group and say, "Hey, I'm not having very much fun," and they can help you. They can either look at your deck and help you diagnose it. I think that's something to keep in mind with all of these is when you do run into that issue, it can be really hard to self-diagnose because you spent time poring over this deck and trying to figure out how you want to build it, and you build it and you feel like it's perfect. Yeah. And then when you play it, it doesn't play the way you want it to, and it's really hard to figure out why after you've been staring at it for so long. And so ask your friends, ask your play group, say, "Hey, this deck isn't doing what I want it to do. Can you help me figure out what's going wrong here?" And it could end up that you need to fix it. It could end up that their decks are too powerful and maybe they play different decks with you, or you build another deck that's like at a higher power level if you like the way this one is. There's more than one way to skin a cat, right? And I
actually really like that, though. I do think people just need to talk with their playgroups more before games, because obviously that's part of the Rule Zero conversation, and say, "Hey, I am playing a deck that is at this power level. It takes this long to really get online. It's looking for maybe a bit of a slower game." So talk about it before, but also talk about it after. If you didn't have fun, be like, "Hey, I didn't feel like my deck did very well. It kind of felt like it wasn't doing these things or was doing these things. What did you think? Have you ever run into that? Could you take a look at my deck list?" Those are really awesome conversations to have as a play group.
Yeah, and admittedly, they can be really hard to have. It can be really easy at the end of a game to point fingers at people, right? And be upset that they played X combo or they played X card. They played Ristic Study and Smothering Tithe, or some of those cards that tend to be like more salty. But at the end of the day, I think it goes a long way to recognize that most people that are playing Commander, obviously everyone's trying to win and make their deck do the thing, but it should be important to them also that everyone else is having fun. Yeah. And so if you can take a step back and ask for that help, it'll be very worth it. So
we've talked about your deck isn't doing enough of the thing. Your deck is too slow. The next one is you end up with an empty hand and nothing to do. This has happened to me in Commander games where it's like turn 5 or 6. Maybe I had a lot of early plays. Maybe I had like 2 mana rocks and I had like a 3-drop and maybe even a 1-drop. And I'm like feeling like I'm moving really fast. And then like turn 5, 6, 7 rolls around. I'm like staring at my hand. I've got like a land in my hand and nothing else to do.
Yeah, and then you're just top decking for the rest of the game, hoping to find something. Yeah. So the solution here is going to be pretty obvious. Add more card draw to your deck. And again, the amount that you want to include can vary. I think sometimes this depends on if you have some sort of card draw effect in the command zone. But then be very wary of what that card draw effect requires and include enough of that to make sure that you actually get to draw those cards. So the guideline here from the deck building template that we like to reference is about 10 pieces of card draw. And for me, again, this has felt like a minimum, like a bare minimum. Yeah. With the hypergeometric calculator that we keep talking about, by let's say turn 5, and you have 10 pieces of card draw, you'll maybe you have a 75% chance to see 1, right? And depending on the curve you're playing, the type of deck you're playing, the types of cards you draw, that is probably not gonna cut it. Again, the math gets kind of complicated because that is going to draw you more cards, right?
Yeah. Then it's going to give you more opportunities to find more.
More card draw. But at 10, that feels like a decent rate, and that is like the bare minimum that I would want to include in a deck. Otherwise, it starts to feel like, oh, I just dumped my hand, I didn't draw any of my card draw. Like, what the heck?
Absolutely. And another thing to think about as you're determining how much card draw you should have, and also just what to do when your hand is empty, is you can also think about mana sinks. There might be cards in your deck depending on your strategy and your theme and all those things, and your commander. If there's a commander, a mana sink in the command zone, that's really something that you can do late game if you don't have any cards in your hand. So that's another thing to consider as well. There are some good effects out there that act as mana sinks for the late game.
Yeah, and a lot of effects that people often refer to as smoothers that can really help with this. I have recently, more when my deck really cares about it, but I've been really trying to include things like the cycle lands, things that have cycling in them.
Yeah.
Right? Because that has the dual purpose of, well, I can use this as a land, or I can cast it if I need to, but also I can just cycle this away and get to see one more card, and hopefully that is like the card draw spell or the ramp spell I need.
That's also why the channel lands are so good, like both Seiju or Otawara. They see so much play. It's because it might be dead in your hand as a land in a late game, but then all of a sudden it has a bunch of utility that you can channel it for.
Yeah, totally. And some of those are, relatively affordable. I will say Otawara and Boseiju probably not so much. Yeah, are pretty expensive versions of that. But there's other things that have effects like that. Like one that I've actually been really excited about, and again, this is in Simic, so you can't put it in every deck, is Colossal Sky Turtle.
Yeah, it has two channel abilities, right?
It has two channel abilities. One of them is a regrowth, which is it returns a card from your graveyard to your hand, and another one is just a bounce spell, which is really cool. So there's ways that you can try to smooth your draws as well. Like not only just drawing more cards, but also seeing more cards. They often talk about scry being, you have to scry 3 times, right, for it to count as a draw technically, because you're not increasing your hand size at all, but you're seeing more cards and being able to select from more cards.
Yep. Red doesn't get very much card draw, but it does get a lot of cards like Faithless Looting, and the new card Demand Answers is really cool. That one is from Murders at Karlov Manor, and it's just like a strictly better effect than some of the other ones in red. Really cool because it lets you see more cards. So if there's something you're looking for in particular, then it can help you draw into that. Even though you may be card neutral or at card disadvantage, it does still act as a smoother in your deck.
Yeah, absolutely. And one thing I want to mention here is we're kind of off of ramp. We're on to card draw now. But recently we got a question about last episode we talked about ramp, and some decks don't want as much ramp necessarily. I want to reiterate that card draw doesn't replace ramp. Like,
yes,
you still need, even if you have to adjust the amount a little bit based on like your mana curve, the cost of your commander, the general cost of your deck, like you still need X amount of ramp and card draw. And even though card draw can get you to more ramp, the problem is the goal of ramp is to be doing it on early turns. Yeah. Right? And so you want to be seeing those cards earlier in the game. So like on turn 4, when you're drawing cards, I would guess that you're hoping to not see ramp, right? Yeah. So that's one thing to be aware of too, is like these don't replace each other. They help, like card draw helps, smoothers help, but you need to have enough of each of these effects for your decks to be effective.
I think that's a great call out. I love that. Okay, well, our next one is what happens when your deck isn't very resilient? So, sometimes it can feel like you have a glass cannon of a deck and it just gets totally shut down after a single board wipe. How do you rebuild? What can you do if your deck isn't very resilient?
Yes, so the classic answer here, right, is run more interaction. That is the classic answer and the hated answer by everyone that plays Gruul decks.
Someone just got really angry when you said that.
Right, exactly. Like you're playing Gruul, you're playing Rakdos. Like, what am I supposed to do when someone board wipes? I don't have counter spells, But I think when people say that, Some people are pretty myopic, right? And say, well, just run more interaction. Everyone plays blue, right? I've felt that way myself sometimes.
You're playing the wrong commander. It doesn't have blue in it.
Yeah, exactly. Get some blue. Get some blue. But I think there are other ways to help your deck be resilient that aren't necessarily interaction, right? Like things getting exiled, things getting destroyed, that's going to be a part of a commander game. And there are things you can do to help mitigate the feeling of your deck being brought to a screeching halt when that happens. So the first one here is protection, right? So this is I would consider this a form of interaction. So sorry, we're going to touch on some of the things that are interaction. In blue, very easy. Counter spells. Boom. Counter spells are great protection for your decks. When I run counter spells in most of my decks, it's not because I want to be the board police, the game police. I don't want to the fun police. I don't want to say screw you and your awesome deck. I'm running them because I have a game plan and I have maybe an expensive commander and I really don't. I want you to put your removal somewhere else, please and thank you.
Yeah.
But blue is not the only one that has effects like this. Like, there are fewer and more far between in other colors. Specifically, green and white have quite a bit of it. Yeah. White, the classic one, is Teferi's Protection. And then
which is kind of expensive, but monetarily kind of expensive. Also, for anyone who is listening to this video, the day that it's published, I believe, is the same day that the Sheldon Menery commemorative Secret Lair is launching on Secret Lair, on Magic Secret Lair. I am very excited about this Secret Lair. And I'm probably going to get it because I love the art, I love the cards, and it's going to a really good cause. So definitely something to look at, and I bring it up because it's got Teferi's Protection in it. So if you don't have a copy of Teferi's Protection, now is a really good time to pick one up.
Yes, indeed it does. But there are other things like this. Like, I just did a quick little search here. We have things like Flawless Maneuver. Again, kind of expensive. Just got reprinted, so it's a little bit cheaper now.
Love that card.
Boromir, Warden of the Tower. Really awesome because it's on a body, it's on a creature. So if you care about getting creatures and swinging in with soldiers, then play Boromir, then sacrifice it. Green has this. Heroic Intervention is like a huge one. Veil of Summer and Veil of Autumn are ones that see play in CEDH that give your creatures and you hexproof from those spells. But then in black, you also have things like the Feign Death effects, right? Those are types of protection that you can play.
Yeah, and those are the ones that say if your creature would die, when your creature dies, return it to the battlefield.
Yeah, some of them even say when your creature gets exiled. Like Kaya's Ghost Form cares about dying or being exiled, and that's such a great way, like, to keep your creatures from being blown out. And black and green also have plenty of cards that say regenerate target creature. Regenerate is if it would die, you tap it instead. But that's such a great, effect to do that.
That's awesome. And in red, one of my favorite effects are like Bolt Bend style effects where you change the target of an instant or sorcery. And that is really fun when someone says, I remove your thing, and you say, no, I remove your thing. And it just feels pretty fun because that type of instant speed interaction isn't always very present in red. And so that's like a really fun and surprising effect that can protect your own stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. And then they also have like some degree of counter spells, right? Like they're kind of the roll the dice counter spells, like Tybalt's Trickery, right? Yeah. Stuff like that they still get to cast something, but hopefully it's not removing your game plan.
Yep.
So the next one on here is one that is near and dear to my heart, and it's Recursion. Because
your favorite.
I love playing Reanimator decks. I love playing black. We've got quite a few here, and really it's pretty prolific in a lot of these colors, right? In black, obviously, you have things like Reanimate, which is, 1 cost, return creature from a graveyard onto the battlefield. You lose life equal to its mana value. You have stuff like Victimize, where you have to sack a creature, but then you choose 2 creatures from your graveyard and return them to the battlefield, but they're tapped. There's ways to get things out of your graveyard in a lot of different colors. White has Recommission and Sun Titan, which both get creatures, or I think Sun Titan gets anything, but Recommission gets artifacts or creatures with mana value 3 or less and puts them just onto the battlefield again.
Yeah, and Sun Titan's cool because it works in a lot of like these synergistic decks. It does have to be a permanent card with mana value 3 or less, but it works in synergistic decks because it triggers on both enter the battlefield and attack. And so it goes in something like Ishin, and it also goes in something like Brago. Ishin is like an attack trigger deck, and Brago is like an ETB blink deck. And so that one actually fits into a lot of kind of fun strategies.
Yeah, and it's a way to keep you from, turn 5, someone board wipes. They've been behind, they board wiped. Oh no, I played most of my creatures. Okay, well, I'll turn 6, Sun Titan, and I get at least one of my creatures back, and hooray, right?
I'm not. Next turn when you attack with them.
And the next turn when you attack, right?
It's a 6/6 with vigilance.
Because it's a 6/6 with vigilance. Yeah, exactly. In green, we have stuff like Eternal Witness, Ball Again Recovery, Regrowth. All of them return a card from your graveyard to your hand, any card. And I think these are the type of effects that even if you don't care about a graveyard strategy, you should be thinking about including in your deck.
I definitely don't play just straight Regrowth enough. I play Ball Again Recovery in a lot of my green decks. I play Eternal Witness in some of my green decks, but I mean, Regrowth is just a really good card. It's pretty darn good because it gets you a key piece of your deck back once it's been removed or used. If it's an instant or sorcery, you can do it again, which is really cool.
Yeah, I mean, it's awesome. It's one cheaper than both Eternal Witness and Ball Again Recovery.
Yeah.
The downside being it's not also a creature or land.
Yes. Yeah, less flexibility, but still a very powerful card.
Yeah, really, really good. And in red and black, or red and blue, you're missing some of these things, right? In blue, fortunately, you do have the protection side of counter spells.
Yep.
Red kind of gets the short end of the stick, I think, in this in this realm specifically, because that's kind of what red do, right? Red go fast is kind of the paradigm. But they also have effects like flashback, which I think are really awesome. Flashback gives you virtual hand size, right? It's an additional card in your hand, technically, because you can play it from your graveyard, and it's a way to catch up. I often, depending on how the game is going, if I have something that I've put into my graveyard that has flashback, I'm typically waiting until I don't have very many cards in my hand. Someone has board wiped, someone has wheeled or something, and I don't have anything else to be doing to then cast my Faithless Looting from the graveyard, flash it back for 2 in a red, or draw 2 cards, discard 2 cards, cast my Deep Analysis for 1 in a blue, draw 2 cards for their flashback cost.
Yep. It gives you just that little bit of extra safety when things have gone really bad. I put an answer to this question of how do you make your deck more resilient. That might be a little funny. We were chatting about it before. Don't play into a board wipe and talk to the table and politic and say, gee, the board's looking pretty crazy right now. Is anyone thinking about board wiping? How are we going to deal with this?
Yeah, how do we feel about a board wipe? This X player is getting really strong over there.
Yep. Or if somebody is about to cast a board wipe, you can be like, wait. Don't board wipe this turn, and I'll swing all my stuff at everybody else, and you won't get hit. And then you can board wipe.
Yeah, politicking it is always an answer, but it may not actually fix the problem.
Don't count on it.
Yeah, right, exactly. I would build what is it? It's plan for the worst and then politic for the best, right?
I like it. That's
you build
great.
your deck planning for the worst case scenario, and then politic your way out of it, hopefully.
Nice. I love it. That's great. Well, our next section is you're always getting mana screwed. Well, also, what does mana screwed mean? We hear that all the time, but you may not be familiar with it.
Yeah, as someone who has one of his favorite decks is a 5-color commander, it is not having all of the colors that your commander needs to be cast, typically, or other cards that you have, right? It's not getting the colors you need.
Or not having enough lands, not having enough mana.
Yeah, or not having enough lands. Yeah. I guess that's typically the way people think about it, is you just don't have enough lands.
But I think both those are valuable. And we already talked about the command zone template calls for 35 to 38 lands. that's actually a pretty good number, and that's really where you want to be, because if you have 38 lands, I'll run the math on this really quickly.
Yes, Professor, tell us.
Then by turn 5, you want to have 5 lands because you want to hit every land drop. You got a 50% chance. At 38 lands, you have a 50-50 shot of hitting your land drops through turn 5. Which is actually not very much.
That's pretty rough. But here's the thing: is you're probably going to see more cards than that if you're including the right amount of card draw.
Yes, sure, yep, yes, totally. But let's say by turn 5, let's be super generous. You've seen 15 cards by turn 5. That's still only 75% that you're hitting all 5 land drops.
Yeah, but yeah. So maybe you need to include more. I think from the hybrid geometric calculator, the answer is probably closer to 40, right? You want to include 40 lands. In my experience, that has left me with a lot of hands with 5 lands and 2 playables, right? And there have been games where I haven't drawn lands and I've gotten really mana screwed, but I have tried to build my decks in such a way that I either have the card draw to actually see 15 cards by turn 5, or to see exactly, to have drawn and 15 cards by turn 5, or at least to have seen 15 cards by turn 5.
Yeah, one of the cards I'm really excited about from Merges at Karlov Manor is the Surveil lands. Feels pretty good. I mean, I know we already had the Scry lands, but Surveil is just better than Scry.
Yeah, it is strictly better.
And they're fetchable, which is pretty sweet. So they're sweet. I really like them, and they help you see more cards of your deck. And you can say, I really need to hit a land drop. Surveil, look at the top card. It's not a land. Okay, maybe I put it in the graveyard this time. Or if you're flooded out on lands, you got way too many lands, you look at the top card, it's a land. That's definitely going in the graveyard.
Yeah, and I think something that helps with this is, again, I'm going to circle back to it because I think it's so good. Cycling. You have the lands that have cycling. They don't tap for multiple colors. So that's something to be wary of if you are worried about getting mana screwed. Some of them do.
Yes.
Some of them do. Not all of them do.
Yeah.
Not all of them do. Some of them are only single colors, but some of them do. And if you are playing a 5-color deck, those might be the ones I would include. But that gives you, if you're mana screwed in the opposite direction, all you have in your hand is land. That is like, those are great lands to have because they're not just dead in your hand anymore and you're waiting once a turn to play them.
Yep.
On the other hand, I would play something like the new land, either basic land cyclers or the land cyclers, right? From the Lord of the Rings set.
We talked about how these effects don't replace each other. Like ramp does not replace lands. Draw does not replace ramp. Land cyclers do kind of replace lands. Like, Troll of Khazad Doom that's the swamp cycler from the Lord of the Rings set. You pay 1 mana, discard it from your hand, and then you get to search your library for a swamp. That is just a tap land. You've tapped a land, and then you get a land into your hand that you can then play potentially untapped. So like, yeah, it kind of does replace the land. And that's why those ones are really good, especially Lorien Revealed. It's just the best out of all of them because it's either a tapped blue mana source or it draws you 3 cards if you don't need more lands. And that is so good.
Yeah. Yes. Play blue, everybody. Play more blue.
That's exactly what I was trying to say with that. No, that's totally it. So play enough lands, but it is very smart to add lands that have multiple modalities or functionality. So things like MDFCs, those are the lands where there's a spell on the other side. We already talked about Bala Get Recovery. That's just a 3 mana regrowth on one side and a tapped forest on the other side. You can play channel lands, which we've already talked about. You can play the cycling lands, or you can play the land cyclers, the spells that are land cyclers. And those are all really good things to help you not get mana screwed. Yeah,
exactly. And when you're building your deck, build it on Moxfield. There are other places that you can build it on. I prefer Moxfield. Yep. And Moxfield will show you the percentage of your deck that is certain colors. So make sure you build your mana base around that. That's one thing because my brain keeps jumping to getting mana screwed in the colors that you need. And if you are not putting the correct amount of those colors in your deck, that's what's going to happen. So make sure that you're keeping an eye on that as well.
Definitely. And if you need to figure out which lands tap for multiple colors of mana, or like let's say you're playing Azorius, you need to know what are all the 2-color lands that I can play in Azorius. There's a website that I really like to use that I would recommend called managathering.com. If you go there, you can see all of the different cycles of lands. You can sort them by the color pairs or even the triomes to see which colors that you can get. So I've actually I have a binder where I keep a lot of my lands, and I actually just sort them by first the color pair and then by the cycle. So like fetch land, bond land, shock land, slow land, fast land, pain land. And it's so nice because now whenever I'm building a deck, I can just flip through that and be like, okay, what are the colors in this deck? And then what are all like, I mostly try and shoot for ones that enter untapped because I like the ability to use my land on the turn that you played it. But there's a lot of other good ones too, like the bicycle lands that are the cycling lands. You pay 2 and you can cycle it away, and it taps for 2 mana. So
yeah,
really,
and we'll have
really
a link.
Resource. Yes,
we'll have a link to all of these websites that we've been talking about in the show notes.
Yep.
So just go ahead and check down there, and you'll be able to find those as well.
Absolutely.
So what we've been covering so far is when your deck is not doing the thing and you're feeling bad playing it. Sometimes you show up to a play group and you play, and your deck does the thing just chef's kiss so well, just beautifully, right? But it's way too much, right? Your deck is
and consistently.
Right?
Yeah.
Yes. Sometimes you pop off, and when you pop off, and that's awesome. But if you're winning 100% of your commander games, that's 75% too much.
Yep, that is kind of an issue. At that point, you are the problem.
Yep, exactly. So, and the problem is one of two things, right? Is your deck is really consistently outperforming other decks. One of two things that we've, I guess, talked about. There could be other things as well. Is that your deck is consistently outperforming other decks, and it just has better cards. The card quality of your deck is consistently better than everyone else's, and they can't keep up.
Or the strategy is just too powerful for the pod and for what the rest of the decks are trying to do. Yeah. Yes.
And on that note, well, I guess we can come back to it. I did want to talk about specific commanders and how they can affect that. And the other one is that your deck strategy isn't very fun to play against.
Yeah, so
and sometimes that can happen.
Let's talk about decks that if you're consistently outperforming the deck, like I said, you might have just built to the wrong power level, and that's okay. But that's why we have, once again, conversations at the commander table. You need to be asking, first of all, set the expectations during your Rule 0 conversation to say, what power level of decks are we playing? And you need to be honest with yourself, because it's easy to say that your deck is at a certain power level, and it's actually much higher than that, or potentially much lower. But it's hard to get everybody at the table to be talking about the same power level. And that's actually a different discussion that we hope to have here in the near future about power levels. But try to have those conversations the best you can. And if you're still having that problem, then you've just potentially built to the wrong power level, and you need to look at swapping out some of the more powerful cards in your deck and replacing them with effects that do the same thing. You still want the ramp, you still want the card draw, but maybe just like slightly less efficient ramp and card draw.
Yeah, and listen, Kelton and I have both had this problem. We've both been this person at our tables where it's exciting. You acquire new cards, they're really powerful, you want to put them in decks, you want to put them in all your decks. But it's making it less fun for everyone else. And for a while, my thought was, okay, well, let's power up everyone's decks. I want to make sure that we can have a conversation after our game about if that was fun or not. And you need to be willing after a game to recognize that maybe it was you that was making it not fun. Yeah. I think I approached that conversation incorrectly for a long time, where I would talk to everyone and say, okay, cool, let's power your decks up then. Let's like keep up. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And
if I'm playing powerful cards, we should all just proxy them so we can all play with powerful cards, right?
Yeah. But that may not be the goal of your group. Your group may say, I don't want to play Rhystic Study or Smothering Tithe or Dockside Extortionist. I want to play, I like my dragon deck. I like my elf deck. I just want to include more cards that are more fun. Like I have more fun cards that I want to play.
Yeah.
Well, then that's great. I'm going to build another deck that fits at that power level or change this one so if it's at that power level. For me, it's really hard to take apart a commander deck. I don't think I've ever done it because I've spent so much time putting it together, and I really should. But it's definitely, if you're getting this from your group, it hurts, and then you need to recognize like it's time to make some updates to your deck and potentially take out some of these just generically good staples.
Absolutely. And talking about powerful decks, you mentioned this and you put this in our show notes. Some commanders just kind of have a floor and are just going to be powerful. So the deck that I've talked about, I think I talked about it on the last episode as well, that I've been working on and I'm into like the 5th or 6th iteration of is Brago King Eternal. So this is a commander. I should just read the card because I think I have it in front of me. Yeah, I do. So it's a 4 mana 2/4 flyer, and whenever it deals combat damage to a player, exile any number of target non-land permanents you control, then return those cards to the battlefield under their owner's control. So there are some cards. I set out to build this deck as Brago, but not Brago. Like I was trying to make a lower power level version of Brago. And so I was like, okay, well, I won't include anything really busted, like Archaeomancer, which is generally not a very good card, becomes really good in Brago because you can loop things like extra turn spells, you can loop counter spells. It becomes pretty miserable to play against. So I was like, okay, like I just won't include any of those cards. But I soon found that the same thing that happens to Archaeomancer, where it's usually not very good and then it becomes really good in Brago, just happens with everything. Like everything becomes all of a sudden very, very powerful in Brago. And I just had to go back and forth so many times to not build too powerful of a Brago deck. It was quite a challenge, to be honest.
Yeah, it turns out blinking every non-land permanent that you have and getting their ETBs again is pretty wild. I mean, Kelton, you showed me some of these decks, and we talked about this at length about a lot of the different iterations of it. And we kind of had some back and forth of like, no, that seems like okay. And I didn't want to keep you from building a deck that you thought was fun.
Yeah.
But at the end of the day, we decided, well, if we're trying to build to this specific power level that our playgroup wants to be at, we can't build this. You shouldn't build this version of the deck because the answer for the rest of us is run more interaction.
Yes. Yeah. And that's not, if anything, any choice that you're making your deck building, if the only answer is run more interaction, it does start to become pretty problematic. And that is how some of these more generically powerful commanders can start to feel. I think Corvold is another example of commander that just has a very high floor. You can build a weak Corvold deck, but guess what? It's still Corvold, and you're still getting a ton of advantage from just playing Corvold. Even if you're just running a generic Jund deck that has Jund cards in it, as soon as Corvold comes down, you've got a giant creature and you're drawing cards, and that's awesome.
Yeah, I mean, by all means, build Corvold, right? But that's one thing to really keep in mind, because chances are if you're playing with Corvold as your commander, you're doing the things that Corvold wants to do. And if you are building into Corvold's strategy, there's only so, not weak, but there's only there is certainly a floor to that strategy with Corvold.
And it's pretty high.
And it's pretty high. It's pretty high.
And that's build Corvold. I will never tell you to not build a commander deck. Just play it in the right pods, right? Yeah. I have a Corvold deck. I'm rebuilding it because I don't like the way it's running now. It's a treasure deck, and believe it or not, Corvold Treasure is so good. And I want to make it more of a flavorful deck. So I'm going to make it a Corvold food deck because I think that would be really fun. I've always wanted to have a food deck, and it's still going to be pretty powerful. I would still never play it in like a lower power pod. But yeah, just play it in the right pod. And that kind of leads into our next point about your deck doing too well, is that sometimes your deck isn't very fun to play against. This is actually one of the things that happened as I was building Brago. I was like, great, I'm not going to run. There was a point where the deck had no instants or sorceries in it because I was like, I want everything to be able to be bounced by Corvold. And I was like, that's fine. I'm not going to play any of the really good removal like Path to Exile or anything like that. And so I was running things like Invasion of Gobakon, which is a battle that enters the battlefield and exiles something, and they can play it, but it costs, I think, 2 more to play. It's the same as Elite Spellbinder, which is a creature that does the same thing. So I was like, yeah, that's fine. Like, I'm not playing any of the really good removal. I'm playing like mediocre removal. Well, it turns out that mediocre removal in Brago just becomes really mean because you can just like exile the entire board and then everything costs 2 mana more to cast. And that is not very fun to play against.
Yeah, it turns out that's actually worse, right?
Yeah, it turns out it's worse. Just run Path to Exile.
Yeah, just play Path to Exile, play some counter spells, and don't put stun counters on all of our creatures every turn.
Yeah, that was one of the major win cons of the deck, is that I could put stun counters on every creature every turn, and that just feels so bad. So there are some cards and strategies that are just really particularly salty, and it may make your deck unfun to play against and become a problem for the rest of the pod. So things like resource denial, things like land destruction, things like stacks. These are some things that can quite frequently be salty for the rest of your playgroup. And you, once again, discuss it with your playgroup. There are playgroups where that is appropriate and that is an expected part of the game. But you should talk with your playgroup and see if you're one of them.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, if you are bringing a deck to the table and saying, well, you can interact with it. Like, it's stoppable. It's interactable.
Yeah.
Which are words that have come out of my mouth. Like, in a non-ironic context in deck building, just realize that your deck is potentially going to be more powerful than maybe you're intending it to be or you're wanting to play with at your playgroup.
Yeah, and not every lower power level decks run less interaction. That's just like how the decks are built. And so if you're like, well, it's interactable, just run more interaction. It's like, that's great. We're playing at a lower power level, and so we're not going to. The decks are not built to do that. So there, once again, you talk as a group.
Yeah, I'm playing Ravenous Chupacabra. I can't.
Yeah.
It can't deal with your Winter Orb.
Spells.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, your Winter Orb. Winter Orb, perhaps. Is it the saltiest card on EDH Rec? They have a page that shows
potentially that Stasis is pretty close.
Stasis.
Which both are you only. I think Stasis is you don't untap any lands, and Winter Orb is that you untap. Each player untaps 1 land each turn, which is pretty rough. And if you're building around abusing that, like you're building a Yorn deck that untaps all of your snow permanents.
Yep.
Then sweet, that feels really good for you. One thing to point out really quickly is that like that generates a lot of advantage for you, and if that's what you want to do, really cool. I would suggest talking to your playgroup, maybe building it as a higher power deck, because you're going to be able to like abuse that and get a lot of value out of it. It's not a win condition. You're not winning the game with that. In the same way that in Brago, Kelton's not outright winning the game by making sure everyone's creatures are permanently tapped with stun counters.
Yep.
Like that was the discussion that we had. Was like. We talked about it like a win condition, and ultimately it's a win in 5 turns condition.
Yep. It doesn't end the game now. It just makes the game really miserable for everyone else for 5 turns.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. So that's something to keep in mind as well, is like do cool things, run the board, man. Like play counter spells, play blue. Just like stalling out the game. We're talking about specific strategy now, but just make sure it's fun for everyone else, right?
That everyone has signed up for a game where it can get stalled out. Yeah.
Yes, exactly.
Definitely. Awesome. Well, this has been really, really great to talk about, and I hope that you all have had some awesome ideas for how you can troubleshoot your decks if you're experiencing any of these symptoms. We're going to have a new episode next week. Please join us again on YouTube or Spotify or wherever you get your podcasts from. You can also find us on thecommanderpod.com. You can contact us there as well. And until next week, remember to always pay the one.